I am Karin Hurd. I'm here with our next edition of Asking for a Friend. And we're going to be talking about a topic we haven't talked about specifically before, which is how do you be a great middle manager? And so I have invited Scott Mautz, who has a brand new book coming out called Leading from the Middle. And so Scott, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. And for all those people that are asking for a friend, it's such a clever name. We know what the code word is it's really you. So I'll answer their questions.
No, don't scare them.
Or if there are questions for your friend, I'll answer those too. Great to be here. Thanks for having me here, Karin.
Oh, so I'm very excited about this. As I was reading your book, I just kept thinking, I was stuck in the middle for a very long time, and I was reading and I'm like, oh, yes, that's the challenge. Yes, that's the problem. Yes, that's the role. And there were two things that I really particularly liked about your book. One is that it's research-based. I mean, this is not a fluffy book. This is a deep content book with it's validated. You've got great references there. I was looking at some of the people you're referencing, some of the research behind it, which was fantastic. And then the second thing, of course, is I love that it was very practical. Like, here's the problem. Here's what you do. Here's the problem. Here's what you do. So I'm really hoping we'll have a very interactive session today, and people will be able to chime in and share share your questions, share your thoughts. So the first thing I would do is I'm having just a little bit. So Jared, I'm just going to tell you, I can't see the comments at the moment. So if there are questions that are coming in, if you can pop them in, that would be great. And David, if you want to come down and make sure I can see those comments, that would be great. So one thing that I would like to just start with is I just want to read a little bit about when you're describing this, middle managers need to be omnipotent. And I thought I have to read this out loud because it resonated with me so much. No one expects frontline, lower level employees to know everything. They're too inexperienced or too new. Senior managers are excused from the standard because they don't need to know everything. That's why they have their middle managers for. Besides, they make big bets all day, which means big mistakes, which among senior leaders are often seen as a badge of honor. So where does that leave those of us who lead from the middle? Like you're expected to know everything, like omnipotence is written into the job description. You have to keep one foot in strategy, the other in day-to-day operations and tactics. You know your business inside and out and know your competitors just as well. Your market share ticked down in Peoria? You should probably know why. You have to explain the what, how, why, and decide who. You must know how to handle the changing nature of work, that remote work, all of that, godly hours. It just goes on and on. I'm like, yes, lived that scene. And I was particularly laughing about the Peoria thing because, with a big drop, and then somebody's like, what's going on there? You're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going on there. And you got to scramble to figure it out. So one of the things that you talk about is you have 21 roles that you say a middle manager needs to fill. And I just wanted to ask you, I know what were some of the ones that really stuck out for me, but I'd like to ask you, what are some of the ones that you think are most critical?
Yeah, I'll just throw out a couple of, Karin. One is, the role of translator, and all middle managers have to do that, right? Their core role is to take everything that's communicated to them from above and then share it and translate it for everybody down below. But a big mistake that we often make is that people in the middle, they kind of forget that you're not just an explainer, you're an expander. And part of the translation role is to provide context to what's being passed down to you. And the very best middle managers we saw in our research, really, they gave the employees a chance to react to the direction and the content being passed down from above, but they provided their own context to it as well, to put a little bit of flavor to it, to show that they weren't just taking things and mindlessly passing them through. So translation is really important. Just like you have to take a foreign language and make it make sense for somebody else. Sometimes what senior management passes down sounds like a foreign language, and you have to translate that and make sense of it, make sense of the world for the people that are receiving it, especially if those people aren't going to agree with it, right? So you have to help that along. So I think translator is a really big role. One other really big one I think that people often miss is the role of strategist. That sometimes, I'll hear, Karin, and I heard this a fair amount We interviewed over 3,000 and had involved in research, over 3,000 successful middle manager executives. And sometimes, for the ones that were successful, we would hear, I don't have time for strategy, right? And maybe you remember this from your days at Verizon, Karin, right? I don't have time for strategy. I'd hear this all the time from my peers. I've got too much to do. But strategic thinking isn't the last thing you should do as a middle manager. It's probably the first thing you should do. And you should remember the 3 key strategy jobs to do, as I call them. First, which is to take the top-down strategies from management and transmit them to everybody else, like we just talked. The second strategy job to do is to shape those top-down strategies in advance. Do the research, know the business, influence the strategies from above before they get passed on down. And then the third strategy is to actually create on-the-ground strategies where you come up with the strategies because you're closest to the customers and you're closest to the marketplace, you're closest to your competitors, and you create those strategies. And it's that last strategy job, frankly, that's most often missed, which is a shame because we came across research that showed, hold on to this one, 80% of projects initiated by top management failed, while 80% of strategic initiatives initiated by middle managers succeeded. So missing that strategy role is it's a big outage. Let me just pause there for a second. Is that those 2 roles, they making sense so far? Then I can go to a third role.
I was laughing when you said translator because I wrote translator down as my favorite one too. And we actually have done a good bit of writing, and we said middle managers need to be translators. Actually use that exact same word. So we were very much on the same page on that one. And one of the things I think about when you think about being a translator is it goes in both directions. So you are a translator down to, right, and translating strategy so people can understand it. They can see themselves in those initiatives. You are also a translator up. And, so when, say, this is what is happening, this is what it's feeling like here. And then positioning that so that it can be heard and not seen as complaining, but it's actually a productive conversation. And I found myself in my middle management roles doing both of those a lot.
Very, very, it's very, very common language. And, I'll throw out one more role that I think is overlooked, when I talk about 21 different roles in the book leading from the middle. But I also, and I'd be curious to see if you agree with this one, because I always viewed Verizon as a very entrepreneurial, innovative company. And, I worked at P&G for many, many years. And I found the role of intra-preneur to be critical for the middle manager, because after all, you're the intersection of all things vertical and horizontal and information flow. And, Deloitte research actually shows us that the most common entrepreneurship trap is when you favor ideas that are too close to the familiar. And our research has shown the best intrapreneurs, I-N-T-R-A, entrepreneurs within a big company, are the ones that don't start by saying, I'm gonna innovate by doing 10% above this initiative we just rolled out. I'm gonna break out of the mold. We're going to take calculated risks. We're going to work underground. We're going to break some rules. Did you find that to be true in Verizon?
It's interesting because we tell this story in our Courageous Cultures book about this big transformation of selling into the small business space. But that was a very much an intrapreneur activity for my sales team, because we knew that, the big thing is clarity. Yes, we need to sell phones. We need to sell revenue, right? But how do we do that? Who do we sell that to? What does that look like? And how does that play out in different markets? And without giving away the whole story and taking too much of the time, one of the things that we found is, how you sell to small business customers in Washington, D.C. is radically different than how you sell it in Cedar Bluff, Virginia, right?
Right.
And so getting people tapping into that creativity, tapping into your salespeople's best thinking in those local markets is definitely a role of how do you be a strategist, and an entrepreneur at a middle management level. Right. And so, no, we're not going to change the merchandising in those stores. All the stores look exactly the same. Right. But we are going to figure out our strategic approach to meeting our customers where they are, giving them what they need. And so I think that's a very interesting part of being a translator. You also talk about being a buffer. And I'd like to talk because being a buffer is hard.
It's hard. It's hard. And for your listeners and your viewers, what I mean by that in the book is sometimes you just have to be, there's so many ways in which you have to be a buffer for upper management, so many scenarios. One of the scenarios we're probably most often common with is when you have a really harsh, upper management with zero emotional intelligence, and they just bang down and they beat on, the people below. And these are the messages, you in the middle, that I want you to share with your troops, right? Just share. If you shared those unfiltered, you would crush people. I used to have a boss, Karin, I'm sure you experienced this. I'm sure David did too in his life. I used to have a boss who was convinced that, micromanagement was the key to everything. And, I've since learned that micromanagement, it crushes souls, not goals. And I used to have this manager who everything he did came across as micromanagement. Every message he wanted us to translate down to the troops, it all smacked of micromanagement. So I had to serve as the buffer to say, all right, let me step back and find out what's his intention here. What is he trying to accomplish? I need to be a buffer, and not to change the truth, not to be disingenuous, not to be tricky or lack integrity, but to find a way to wrap the message in a way that the troops can receive so that it's close to the intent, even if the execution wasn't very good. I'm sure you've experienced the same thing.
Oh, yes. And David just typed in, lightning rod. That's how he describes it. How do you be a lightning rod so that the energy still comes through, but you soften it in a way that can be heard, and that you're going to be most effective for the team, because you, as the middle manager, know your team, and you don't want to, the pressures and the stress that they're under, and you don't want to create more, but you do need to create the change that caused that energy to start.
That's exactly right. And, and one thing I did want to bring up, Karin, about the roles, and that, we'll go wherever you want to go. I find this very interesting. So I talk in the book about the different roles that we have to play as middle managers. And people often say, okay, Scott, what's the biggest unique challenge of being a middle manager? Is it all the roles that I have to play because they exhaust me? And common sense says yes. And the research shows us one of the biggest problems, the most unique challenges of being a middle manager is because you're in the intersection of the vertical and the horizontal information flow. For sure, that is exhausting because of the amount of work that you have to do, given all the roles you have to play. But what research is now showing us, especially neuroscience and psychology, is showing us there's another culprit underneath that makes the middle manager job so unique and so challenging. It's not just the work generated by the number of roles like we've been talking about. It's the fact that you have to do these micro transitions across the roles all the time. And it's psychologically exhausting. So for example, and I know this has happened to me, within the span of a meeting sometimes, not just a day, you have to transition from being in quiet mode with your boss, where you're going to be, deferential to your boss. Then you have to transition over to authoritative mode with your employees. Then you have to transition into collaborative mode with your peers. Sometimes you do that all in one meeting, moving from high position and high power roles to low position, low power roles where you have, no authority at all. That turns out to be more exhausting, mentally switching gears in those micro transitions than the amount of work that those roles themselves generate. Do you find that surprising? I did in the research.
Yeah, that's real. I mean, that really makes a lot of sense, though, and you're having to shift. It's a different kind of energy, and you're having to be very managing the politics of all of that and doing the right thing for the business at the same time. So I want to talk about one more role, and I'm going to shift gears, but I would love to hear if anyone has a question for Scott. Your friends have a question about being a middle manager. The accountability czar. We have to talk about accountability czar.
Yeah.
But can you talk about how do you do that well? And what do you mean by accountability czar?
Yeah. I guess right at the core of it, accountability czar is, again, I go back to the fact that when you're a middle manager, you're in the intersection of the vertical and horizontal flow of information. So many things flow through you. And it is so easy to project, think of the impact if you as a middle manager choose not to show up as being accountable, practically being accountable, taking responsibility. It has a ripple effect because for everybody, for people above, they're not going to like it. But for everybody around you, they're going to feel like, okay, that's the nature of the culture around here. We don't have to do anything to show up as accountability, is accountable. So being in the middle, I argue, it's even more important than senior manager's job in holding people accountable. Because you're in the center of all the activity, I believe it's really your job as a powerful, successful middle manager to say, look, we're going to deliver what we said we're going to deliver. We're going to do it well. We're going to have fun. We're going to do it in a fulfilling way. But we do need to deliver these results at the end of the day. And I think it's more important for the person in the middle than anybody else. Do you agree with that? Do you find that that's true relative to even senior managers?
Yeah. What I really resonated when I was reading that element of your book was it's not just holding your team accountable. It's a great middle manager. And that's why I think you had the word czar, is because you are holding your team accountable, but you are also not afraid to have the tough conversations to hold your peers accountable. Of course, you're doing it in a diplomatic way. And even most importantly, you are willing and have the courage to hold your senior team accountable.
That's right.
And I think it's that
everybody
160, right?
That's everybody. That's right. And it could be tricky. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, Karin, that it's easy to hold your boss's boss accountable to the resources they said they were going to give you, or to the promises that she kept and the rewards she said she was going to give your team. I'm not saying that that's easy, but if you're honest, direct, truthful, a lot of the same principles apply of when you need to give feedback up the food chain. Just being honest, direct, discuss intent before content, before you discuss something like that with senior managers. But it's a critical part of the middle manager role.
Okay, good. Thank you. We have a question here, and this is a very good one from Sean. And how can we help our middle managers, not burn out? So if you're a director and then you've got a manager and then they have a supervisor. So and that's a tough role. Yeah. How do you prevent that?
It's a fantastic question. And I certainly go into the book a lot about this. I talk a lot about the signs of burnout and, how to avoid that. I even talk about, there's a couple of ways there's really two things. It starts with an assessment of actually the work that's being done. And people usually say, okay, well, all right, if you want to prevent burnout, you got to take a look at, all right, is it too much work? Yes, of course you have to look at that, but there's other things you have to look at. You have to look at, are your middle managers doing the right work? Are they getting the response to the work that they should be getting? That's another key part. A lot of what causes burnout is, it's not that it's too much work, it's that trying to progress a goal or a project takes so much work because peers aren't collaborating. There's pockets of political influence changing the way things are happening. It's not just always about the amount of work. So step one is to really be clear about the amount of work they're doing. Is it the right work they're working on? Are they getting the response to the work that they should be getting? And if not, as a leader, can you help barrier bust? I remember working, Karin, with a young woman on my team that was suffering from burnout. And it turns out, she was an absolute machine. Just one of those people that, type A, you couldn't give her enough work. But when you dug deep, I found out that the source of burnout was that her peers were jealous of how good she was. And they were, some cross-functional peers were doing some things to block progress. That's a different source of burnout just than how many projects is she working on? Yeah. Is it the right project? So that's kind of step one. Before I go into step two, does that make sense to you? Is that consistent with your experience?
It does a lot. And we call that focusing on the MIT and the most important things. And if there is always going to be more work than you can possibly do. So I had one of my favorite bosses, Maureen Davis, if she's listening, but she said to me, hey, Karin, here's your scorecard with 27 things. Which of them are you going to fail at? And I was like, I'm not going to fail at anything. And she's like, here's the thing. You can't possibly do all these things equally well. If you're going to drop a ball, I want to know which one it is that you're planning to drop. And I think that is so smart, right? So help your middle managers know what's vitally important.
Yes, I think that's step one. Boy, I could talk all day about this. So I'll just hit one other highlight for Sean. It also goes to, you prevent burnout when you truly understand what is motivating to your employees. And, I've been doing work on this area for over 15 years, actually closer to 2 decades now, deep research on what really motivates us at work. And, as it turns out, Karin, I'm sure you and David have found the same to be true. It's not perks, it's not promotions, it's not pay. There's nothing wrong with any of that. That's all that stuff is great. But if you want to prevent burnout, you have to get to the source of meaning for the employee. What is the sense of purpose that they have at work? What's the legacy that they want to leave behind at work? How many of us have ever asked that of our employees? What do you want your legacy to be here? And how can I help you achieve that? Helping them to just engage in what helps them to learn and grow. How can you enhance their sense of self-confidence and self-esteem? How can you create a caring culture? It's all these elements that add up to a meaning-rich environment. I talk about it a ton in my first book, Make It Matter. And it's as simple, sometimes it's as simple, Karin, as this. Check this out. Like a lot of people are like, all right, Scott, so if you're talking about, I want to work with a sense of purpose so that I don't burn out. That sounds great, but that's daunting. I don't know how to define my purpose.
Yep.
Sometimes it's as simple as starting with what are your values?
Yep.
And then living those values every day. And that's not as easy as that sounds, because research shows that as many as, depending on the research source, as many as 70% of people can't articulate their most closely held non-negotiable values in under 90 seconds if you ask them to. So there's work to be done to define those values even, but even if you just live your values simply every day, it creates purpose, which creates meaning, a core source of preventing burnout. Have you found that to be true as well?
Absolutely. In fact, in our long-term leadership programs, that we have something called building your own leadership playbook. And what are your values? What are your operating principles? Get people to ground themselves. How do they relate to the company's values? But what do you own? What is it that you would, and we actually asked that question. What is your leadership legacy to be? And it's so funny because 20 minutes before I came here with you, I was just talking to an HR director who had just done her leadership playbook. And she said, so interesting. We just talked about we have these challenger groups. So they're little mentoring groups that happen in between sessions. She said, I've worked with some of these folks for 15 years and we've never had this conversation about what do we really personally value. She's like, it was very eye-opening. So I thought that was very interesting. Angela is giving us a lot of great insights here. She's saying sometimes people just take on as middle managers too much. And I do agree with you, Angela. And your other comment about how you sometimes you do that because you want to be needed. And I think so if we are a manager of middle managers, helping people, know when enough is enough and what they don't necessarily need to take on.
Yeah, that's really true. One small tip that I only because Karin, I know that this show is about practical advice. I anticipated this comment and this question. Angela's absolutely right. A lot of times it comes to personal issues that the manager had. They take on too much. Can I share one tip that I used to use because I used to take on too much all the time? I call it the 50-50 rule. I talk about it in the book. And 50-50 rule is simply this: when things are getting crazy and you're that type of person to take on everything when things are getting busier rather than to step back. I use the 50-50 rule. It says in those moments, you spend 50% of your time on pragmatism, 50% of your time on possibilities. And here's what I mean by that. If you take all of the time you have and say, out of that, I'm only going to take half of that time to focus on, as you call it, Karin, the MIT. I'm going to be brutal about it. Pragmatically speaking, if I'm only going to take half of all my time, that really forces you to focus in on the MIT, step one. Step two, but what we miss in research is that other 50% of the time, you could spend on seeing possibilities in the moment. And what happens is when we get so crazy, guess what? We float from everyone else's agenda to everyone else's agenda, everyone else's most important thing to everyone else's most important thing. We just strive to cross things off our to-do list, bouncing all around. And we bypass the possibilities that are in front of us in the moment, the opportunities to grow, the opportunities to grow market share, ourself, whatever it might be. And what I used to find is that by spending 50% of my time on pragmatism, 50% on possibilities, guess what? 50 plus 50 equals 100, which means you have 0% of your time left for spiraling down and worrying about how much you're taking on. So 50-50 tip, it really worked for me.
Oh, that's interesting. So David has chimed in with one of his favorite questions, and we get this question all the time. So I know he wants to say, how's Scott going to answer this question? One of the toughest tasks is taking leadership responsibilities when you may not agree with the outcomes. how would you respond to that one?
Yes, I talk about this in the book. Excellent question, David, and we've all been there. It's one of the most difficult things in the translator role, I think, is when you have to pass down stuff that you think is a bunch of baloney. So that's where I always go back to comparing, intent with execution. Even if I don't agree with it, I always would share what is the intent of what the boss and the managers above me are trying to say. If I've built trust with my organization, I start with trying to be truthful to the intent of what they're trying to accomplish. And when you start with intent, in my opinion, that gives you leeway and room to express where, okay, here are some things that I might not necessarily agree about within the execution. Their intent of what they're trying to do is this. Okay, so that's step one. But what still remains is, okay, Scott, I got you, but they still have to do what the boss has said. Mm-hmm. If you throw them off track, they're going to see inconsistencies. So what do I do about that? That's where I find, once you've communicated intent and that's, clear, I always position it as kind of work in progress. It's a working directional agenda from my boss. So I say, this is the way we want to go. Where are all of you guys in this? This is their intent. I don't necessarily agree with all of these things. What do you guys think? I get the feedback. Mm-hmm. And then I use that one round to go back to my management. You have to be brave and say, okay, I shared your direction. By the way, I don't really agree with it. Here's some of the comments that came back from the team that they also don't agree with it. Do you want to address these things and adjust anything? And if they say no, then I always would go back a second time and say, hey, I've discussed my concerns and your concerns with my management. Debate, decide, commit. Here's what they decided to change. Here's what they didn't decide to change. A lot of times resistance is just people wanting to be heard. Yeah. So I tried to create an avenue where they felt heard and they saw me as authentic and genuine, saying that I didn't necessarily believe, everything. But at the end of the day, we have to debate, decide, and commit. Is that consistent with how you guys would handle that?
I only have a couple more minutes left, so I want to make sure we get I'm not dodging the question, but I know you have this AMPLIFY model, and I want to put that up on the screen and just tell us a little bit about this, because this was a really important part of the book that I wanted to make sure we got in.
Yeah, excuse me, you bet. I'm sure it'll come up on screen here in a minute, but there we go. It's pretty straightforward. What I found was, and I know you're going to laugh at me with this, Karin, I know probably, and David would too. But what I've found is that when we interviewed the incredible amount of successful middle managers that we did, and we were trying to get, what's the essence of your job? They were describing all the core things, and they kept using the same word, amplify, over and over again. My job is to be an amplifier. I take what my management says, and I amplify that in the right way. I take what my people are doing and they should be proud of, and I amplify it up to my bosses. The amplify in every direction. And then when we boiled down the categories of activities that they engage in, it wasn't very hard to back in to the acronym AMPLIFY. And I think what you and David would laugh at is, as practitioners, sometimes you'll come across people that force an acronym just to have an acronym. I wrote down the buckets of things that were the most common activities of the most successful middle managers, and it lined up pretty nicely. I think in the case, meshing was the only word I had to change. Meshing is another word for collaboration.
So pick one of these concepts and tell us about it.
I think adaptability, I'll go with very quickly. Okay. It makes sense, right? When you're in the middle, you have to be supremely adaptable as a middle manager. And what I've found is the key to adaptability as middle managers, there's 3 types of flexibility that you have to demonstrate: intellectual, emotional, and dispositional. Intellectual flexibility is exactly what it sounds like. You have to be able to take data, make assumptions. Then you have to react to new data. You have to know when to stick to your guns, when not to stick to your guns. You got to have emotional flexibility to be adaptable, which means you're not going to get carried away in the moment, or you're going to know when the moment is to really show passion and not just be cold and distant. Then the final kind of flexibility is dispositional flexibility, which means you have to be predisposed to be adaptable, which means you have to have a kind of a can-do attitude, a let's see attitude, a willingness to admit you don't know everything, to roll with the punches and to excel and embrace change rather than be afraid of it. So the Amplify, it's really the core of chapter 3 in the book of what I talk about, that we're at chapter 2 that we all need to focus on as middle manager.
Very, very nice. So I have to ask you, because we're all about building courageous cultures around here,
Yeah.
a culture where people will speak up, they'll share ideas, a culture of psychological safety, where the default is to contribute. What advice would you have give a manager who is trying to create a courageous culture?
I think maybe just two very quick things. I think being incredibly good at giving feedback is so important. And I am convinced, I don't know this for sure, I will bet that you and David are absolute experts at giving feedback. And I've found that I've had, that's a skill I've built over the years. And it's so important to be able to give feedback up, down, and across. And I talk about how to do that in the book. And I think the second thing is to create, in the spirit of a courageous culture, what I call an environment of relaxed intensity, which seems like it doesn't make sense, but it's kind of a different twist on work hard, play hard. And I've found personally, and in my research, that people that create relaxed intensity as leaders, they create this, we've all been on teams where it was, go, get it done, do it. We've got to win, but there was no fun. That's hard. I've been on teams that were the opposite. It was all fun. We laughed, we loved our job, and we were miserable or we were lovable losers because we were losing in the marketplace. The middle, to me, is where a courageous culture lives, which is you're proud enough and confident enough to be relaxed and having fun, but you're smart enough to be courageous to know when it has time to be intense, to put the game faces on, to go deliver, and to find the sweet spot between those two things.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Scott. Leading from the Middle, very great book. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today.
Thanks for having me here. It was a ton of fun.